Now, I don't claim to be like a knife thrower or somebody who has skill with that. Usually if I do throw a blade, it's usually a bigger one, like a Bowie knife, something like that. But this actually, it kind of feels like it would stick pretty good. So I'm gonna go ahead and give it a toss and just see what I can do. Try to figure out my distance. Probably about here. It's not a bullseye, but that's not too bad. It's in the yellow. Let's try it one more time. All right, up next, a little test on a pumpkin. So I have my Demko knives, ARMIGER 4. And these are some tiny triangles that my daughter made, but that'll give me a little bit of articulation and skill to use this blade. I suppose I could use the mini. Okay, I have this one with the shark's foot. That would be really, really good for carving because it's got a thinner profile, and just in general, I think that one would work well. But I'm going to try the 4 first and just see how it does. And actually, it's not too bad. Obviously, this has a really good piercing tip. I would say this blade is made to stab into things. It definitely appears to me to have no trouble with that whatsoever. Okay. Now it's, cold enough out that it was actually just covered with snow yesterday. Some of that melted off, but this pumpkin is probably still frozen. So if you ever carved a pumpkin with your kids, you usually use a little saw or something like that. But this is pushing through the material just fine by itself. This knife came razor sharp from the factory. I expect nothing less, but I'm really happy to see that it was just wicked sharp from the factory. 80 CRV. In general, I've found that it takes a really, really nice edge. It's a very consistent steel in my experience. I almost prefer it when it comes to carbon steels. Toughness is another part that doesn't get talked about enough. It's a pretty tough steel. And being in a colder environment, I think it does just fine. All right, now into the nose. No problem at all. Not difficult. Now, I didn't do the typical thing and open up the pumpkin and haul out the insides because I wanted to cut against as much material as possible. I may still do that yet, though. Now the smile. This will have the most articulation for the blade. All right. I suppose I'll go ahead and cut the top just like you usually do. And this part, it definitely still feels kind of frozen. But it's cutting nicely. Sinks in there, no problem. I find that a blade length of this, about a hand width blade, it's kind of the Bushcraft standard for a reason. You can do so much with a blade that deep. It obviously has enough reach that defensively you could do something with it, and enough blade there that you can make some slicing cuts when you're processing a little bit of food or you're doing something outdoors, but it's not so long that it's hard to actually navigate. There we go. I wouldn't say that batoning is super important to me, but I'll go ahead and back it up. I'll do a few logs and a few splits just so that you can have some confidence that yes, the blade does in fact do a little bit of batoning if you really needed to. That was some pretty hard oak, but it splits nice. This one's kind of curvy. It's got that exposed tang on the back, so I can beat it through a little bit. Ooh, that's actually a pretty good knot. Definitely bending the steel a little bit. Yeah, I'm gonna have to push it all the way through. There it is. The edge itself doesn't appear to have any defects or any damage. The coating did not stall it or keep it from being effective either. It wasn't grabbing that coating too much, as far as I can tell. Now I know what you're wondering. You're thinking to yourself, but how is it going to hold up against drywall? It's a very good practical medium. Not really. I have some drywall here. Let's find out. Two. Gets through two. That's it's better than I was maybe expecting. Well, it does okay with drywall. Now for a tire. Let's see if I can get through that tire wall. Oh yeah. Actually, it's cutting pretty good. Wow. Not too bad. For such a thick blade, I shouldn't say it's really thick. We'll just call it robust. I suppose generally a robust blade. This thing actually slices pretty good through something that normally gives me a little bit of trouble. It's not the stab that's difficult with knives. It's, first of all, not losing an edge when you're cutting through Kevlar. And the slicing motion is usually more difficult. This knife seems to be handling it decently well. Make myself some target straps out of this for the range. If you're ever looking for something that lasts a long time for shooting, hanging your gongs for shooting, rubber, Kevlar, from the sidewall of a tire, or just hanging them from the tire all together. You don't have to cut it up. It seems to work pretty good. Well, that's a thick part right there. Probably destroy the edge altogether if I cut through that. Might have to grind that last bit out. Okay, well, most of the way there. It's doing pretty good. Neither of these blades are advertised as woodworking blades exclusively. That's not, you know, the main market that I think they're going after. These are a little bit better understood as general purpose, maybe defensive, survival type, utility type knives. I don't think I've ever seen any advertising for this that pushes it towards a bushcraft community or anything of that nature. But I like to use blades with wood. I mean, that's what I do. I'm a whittler, I'm a carver. Somebody who, if I have a knife It pretty much doesn't matter what kind of knife it is. Outside of a chef's knife, I'm probably going to try it on some wood, and even some chef's knives. LT Wright would be an example. So a survival knife, if it's going to be in that category at all, it needs to have some capability to work with wood, and has to have a handle that's comfortable enough to do the task. And so this handle is something I need to talk about a little bit as far as those kinds of ideas. And this little utility guy here. It's really not that bad. As far as a shark's foot goes, this Wharncliffe style blade, it actually has a decent amount of bite and controllability. And the handle, I know it has this guard on here, and there's some advantages to having a guard. It's not exactly a bushcraft handle, but that rubberized texture allows you to get a really good purchase on it. I do think it's comfortable, and it also gives confidence because it's not going to slip. You do have some, stoppage if your fingers do tend to go forward on you when you're carving or whittling. That doesn't happen to me very much. I rarely cut myself when I'm working with a knife, but it does happen. I would say this guard is probably the main thing on both designs that's going to get in the way if you like to apply thumb pressure in the back. It's going to get in the way a little bit, but it's really not that hard for me to mitigate that on the big one. If you can see here, I get a really nice hold on that. The purchase gets all 4 fingers, and my thumb just goes a little bit ahead of the hilt, or the guard, rather, right there. Just goes a little bit ahead, and I don't have to put it back here, but you could. And I think you can still get pretty adequate control. One of the best parts about this knife is that the edge, the sharpened edge, goes all the way back, and there's just a small sharpening trail right there, but the blade goes all the way back, so you can actually get up really close into what you're cutting, and it helps with that control. If the blade started further out here, you would have to be finding some other way to hold the knife. It just wouldn't be as natural. So I like that this edge goes all the way back, again, to where that sharpening trail is, very small sharpening trail. I need to make sure I'm clear that not every knife is designed supposed to be a woods knife. It's not every blade maker's intention that a blade is really set up for woods work in general. And this blade is a really great all-arounder blade, and it can do some woodwork. I know it's not designed as a bushcraft knife. It's not exclusively a survival knife. I think it's kind of a many trades, many tasks blade. It's kind of a master of none, but does really good at many of them. If I was to put it into one camp, I would actually say defensive. The way that it's built with this really comfortable ergonomic handle, the grips on top. One thing that Demko does well is they've got these serrations, or not serrations, this jimping rather, and the jimping is just in this molded rubber. It's pretty comfortable, right about there. And so it's in a position that you would maybe hold a knife if you were actually, stabbing into something or prying a little bit perhaps. But it just gives you a little grip there, and it just feels a little bit more like a defensive blade. But I use blades in the woods a lot, and any blade I have with me, it's got to be up to the task to do a little bit of minimal notching and woodworking, the kind of things I would just do around a campsite generally. It doesn't have to be a carving or whittling knife, and I'm not going to hold this to that standard, but I'm going to maybe carve a couple tent pegs with it and just see how it does with that handle, the blade edge geometry, and general comfort. So in the springtime, when it's really muddy and the ground is just too wet, it's hard to find a place to sit down, or I can't find a log or something to work against on the ground. Sometimes I'll just find a tree like this and post up against the tree, and it gives me a safe backdrop for working against without doing it over my knee or my leg or something, which I've done before, but I don't know, that's kind of risky. So just making a regular old notch here. I think it's in some maple. The bite is decent. Control is pretty good. Actually, you know, the rubberized handle, I'm a really big fan. I really like the rubberized handle on these blades. Just control-wise, comfort, it's so much less likely to give me a hot spot quickly. And I think that's the main issue I have with a lot of other fighting knives or defensive type knives or utilitarian knives for that matter, is their handles sometimes are just built in a way that's not able to be comfortable in any other task other than a defensive use, which comfort is not going to be my concern in defensive use. Effectiveness is going to be, you know, what I want to know about in defensive use. So this right here, just doing a competent job, small task like this, for when I go camping or I'm backpacking. I remember one time I was camping with some guys and somebody forgot all their tent pegs, and I did not pack my usual Bushcraft loadout. It was pretty lightweight, but I had one blade with me, and it's all I needed is one blade that can do the job well, competently, better than a slip joint would do. Lots of guys have a little folding knife in their pocket, something like that, and it's just not comfortable, and sometimes they fold on you. I don't really like slip joints all that much for like any use outside of opening boxes and things. I think they look cool, they're super neat, but as far as doing the stuff I'm doing now, I wouldn't use a slip joint for this. I wouldn't use the regular old little tiny pocket knife. Now I would use a Demko blade, and in fact I've got a review about this. This is the 80-20.5. This I would use. This thing's tough as nails, it's very practical, and it is not your grandpa's old slip joint blade. It's very different. But if I was just gonna make my regular old tent peg, sure, this will do fine for a tent peg, and comfort is very good. One thing I was concerned about early on was I was thinking to myself, I wonder if this, let me get a little closer. So my concern initially was I'm looking at the handle, and it's not as thick as some of those Bushcraft knives I use. I can get by without that. Not as broad, I can get by without that. It doesn't have a bunch of like really ugly finger grooves that make it difficult to use the blade. But it has these hilts, or these guards right here, rather. And I don't usually like a guard on a knife. Maybe in this designation, a knife that's designed this way, sure, it makes sense. But in other tasks, I thought it would just be really uncomfortable to have to use something like this, and it gets in the way. Not too much, actually. As I was using the blade there, as long as you're not, you know, crafting for a very long time, making quite a bit of stuff, or carving spoons, I actually don't think this was too bad. These didn't run in the way as much as I thought they would. The fact that the blade goes back very, very far, it's ground almost all the way back. It's just a very small sharpening trail there. It allows me to get really good control and get up on it, so that if I am doing a task that requires some control, like this right here, the cut itself feels safe to me. It feels controlled. I don't feel like I'm way out here where the blade is, that's generally unwieldy. If I have to start out here, and some of these blades that have big finger choils and they're too broad and too long and all that, this being a little bit more of a utility friendly blade, I can get right up there to where the blade starts and make a powerful cut without too much concern. Also, chest lever. And I don't have too much concern about what portion of the blade is coming out, because I can get way back here and there's not much hanging over, so it actually feels relatively safe and controllable. All right, the mini with the shark foot. This should be a challenge. and the 80/20. So in my opinion, that proved a little bit difficult for the Mini. I think that cutting surface, that length right there, it's not a lot. It does obviously have plenty of pass-through. It's just that's not a lot of slicing action and trying to slip it through. And the edge isn't terribly used. It's not beat up bad. It's not as sharp as it was out of the factory. I think if I had honed it first, it would slip through a little bit easier, but binding up a little bit as it went down, it is, relatively thin. But as far as steel goes, there's a couple limitations there. You do need to touch it up from time to time, but with EDC blades, I don't mind that. That's okay. And this was definitely the smoothest feeling in hand. Not that the handle is more comfortable than the Armiger, but actually the function of the blade slipping through the steel, it's not very thick. Whoops. It's not very thick. This is like the easiest knife to open in the world. I don't know how I missed that. This blade, this has got to be one of the best folding knives I've ever used as far as EDC stuff goes and fidgety blades. I don't know how I missed that. Anyways, thickness is not bad. And pass-through is very, very good. And there's a little bit more belly and sweep to it, so it slipped through really, really well. And obviously, the Armiger has the thickest blade stock, and it did okay. I wouldn't say it was excelling at slipping through. I felt a little bit of resistance as it was going. Lots of penetration, lots of pass-through this way, but I needed to push and get to that one spot where I could start sliding. It didn't seem to be binding because of the thickness or the coating per se. I think it's just the fact that this is double thick cardboard. Like a regular sheet of cardboard, it would almost be no resistance to all three of these blades. It would slip right through. But this thicker stuff is, and just look, it's almost like cutting wood. It's relatively firm and stiff, and then this side obviously is even harder yet than normal cardboard would be. But I would say it did decently well, and I wouldn't complain about that, especially if I was cutting up a handful of boxes for a project and I need to throw some stuff away like what I'm doing right now. I would not complain about the performance of the blade right there. Again, as far as an EDC utility kind of blade, this would do just fine in that task. For a blade like this, I don't need it to be an amazing feather sticker. But like I said, generally utility friendly. It needs to be able to do some tasks reasonably well and just be competent in general. So I'm going to clear off a piece of this kind of flaky outside wood. This is not a good piece to feather stick on. It's a piece of oak that has lots of kind of burly nature to it, and that's okay, because if I'm out in the woods, this is a very likely piece of wood that I would find. Even the fact that it's already quartered up is just that much easier. So I'm going to go ahead and try to throw down a couple usable curls. I find that flat grinds and saber grinds and convex grinds in general, those types can actually make a lot of really thin usable curls. People think that Scandies make the best curls, but I think it's all a skill set. I think it doesn't matter which one you use, as long as it has a serviceable edge and you understand the wood you're working with. I think you can make curls like what I'm making, at least this good, with most pieces of wood of equal thickness and consistency of grain. And like I said, just a serviceable edge. I mean, you really could feather stick with almost anything. You could feather stick with a sharp piece of glass. It's just a matter of, is it conducive? Is it comfortable? Do I have to really work for it? And this is a hard piece of oak, seasoned well. And I would say it's doing an all right job. For a blade that's not designed for woodwork, in my opinion, in my estimation, I think it's actually pulling out some usable curls. It's not the pretty kind of feather stick that you maybe are used to seeing on my channel, and I'm really okay with that because I just need functional, and this looks very, very functional to me. Now, when it comes to how you're going to ignite things, this blade, I'm going to come in a little closer. It wouldn't be difficult on a blade like this with this coating to either take a file at home and just knock off a little part of it there. You know, it's going to expose it to the elements more, but if you want this to be just generally utility friendly and outdoors friendly, just knock off a little piece, a 1/4 inch of that. You could take a Dremel even if you were careful, and just knock off some of the coating on both sides, and then you have a fire steel notch right there. It would not be difficult. I've actually done it out in the woods. I've been frustrated with a blade before that had way too much coating. Okay, it was a knife company that's no longer in production, but that particular knife had so much coating and it was really thick. It had tread on it, and I actually took a rock, a piece of mica, and I struck the spine repeatedly, many times, and then I went to my fire steel and I was able to ignite with the fire steel with just knocking it with a rock over and over. So if you needed to, you could use a rock, you could rough it up, or a little bit of just an abrasive substance. You could sand it down or hit it with a file, which would be my recommended one method at home. Just hit that with a little file on both sides, and this will strike a fire steel. I'm confident. It does seem to have a decent hardness, and so I don't think most of those Chinese or the actual Swedish fire steels are going to give you any trouble if you do it that way. All right, diving into the handle a little bit, you do have an exposed pommel on the end. It's only a bit, man, that hangs out like a 1/16 or 2, something like that, a couple mils at the most. It's not much that's exposed there. I suppose the value of that exposure is, first of all, to prove that it goes all the way back, so that's cool. I like that it goes all the way back and that this is a really strong, I would say slightly overbuilt blade for sure. But that right there, I think you could maybe crush some stuff with it. If you miss, you're probably going to damage the handle a little bit. That might not matter to some people, but it's, you know, it's a rubberized handle and it'll absorb some sort of shock, I suppose, as you're crushing things. If you're going to use it as an impact device, okay, just remember that's a felony, but if you're going to use that as an impact device, I suppose that would put somebody into submission or give them a real knock on the head with it. I don't know. But these kinds of things in general, I just don't use a lot, and so I don't see a huge practical purpose for having it on there. It does look cool and it doesn't get in the way. So that would be kind of my philosophy. As long as it doesn't get in the way and it's extra, cool. And it doesn't get in my way. I like the lanyard hole. It doesn't have any sharp edges. In fact, I'm going to say on this knife in general, the benefit of having a handle like this rubberized handle, is that there's nothing sharp here. Whereas with like micarta or wood, you know, if they didn't sand it out, the edge of these transitions would be kind of sharp and rough. And even on customs that are in that $300 and $400 price range, they're usually a little bit rough. But this one's not. And so transitions are all smooth, including this right here, your lanyard hole. That is flared. And so when you run a piece of paracord or something even larger through, it could fit something slightly larger. If you run that through, it's not going to hang up on stuff, and this isn't going to be grabbing on your hand if you have slightly bigger mitts than I do. So I'm 6'5", like 225 pounds, yeah, more than that, 240 pounds. And for my hand, you can see the handle is not totally swallowed up. You could have bigger hands than mine, and plenty of people do. I think Andrew Demko does actually have bigger hands than mine. Look at that. Plenty left over. So that's decent. The thickness, I'll get to the tang in a little bit, but the thickness of the handle is sufficient. It does have rounded edges. Like I said, everything is rounded here. A little bit of jimping right here for control. If you're cutting on something that's a little more fine and you're pressing into it, this will give you some control. As I use gloves in the winter time, I'm not gonna be able to feel that, but I suppose it'll give a little more traction on my rubberized gloves. The thickness for like keeping your fingers out of your palm, you know, it's not going to be thick enough to do that, but at the same time, I really don't have a complaint about this. I suppose it's because it fits almost perfect. It melts into my hand particularly really well. If you can tell, there's a little bit of a type of swell, I guess I'll call it, and a reduction towards the first finger position and your pinky position. So for me, for whatever reason, this fits absolutely perfect. There's not a part of this knife that doesn't fit perfectly in my hand. Like if I had custom made a blade for a guy of my size with my hand size, this seems perfect. Now I could go thicker on there if it was a crafting style handle, but I don't want to. This is not a crafting style blade for me. It's more utility friendly, defensive, and I like the way that the handle is crafted, particularly for that use in my hand. Working with it for a long time, I would want it thicker. Okay, if I was cutting a lot of material for some reason, I would just want it thicker. But you know, it's very practical, it's lower weight, it's got a smaller footprint, it fits nicely with the sheath. In fact, I'm going to take the sheath off here. Let me just show you. Footprint is not bad. That slips into a pack or into a pocket really nicely. So I'm not going to complain about that. It's just something that you should know though. The width of the handle seems sufficient for me. Again, it's slightly tapered in one or two spots, and then a little more broad towards that middle where your middle finger is, just to try to keep your hand from biting into here. Grip strength, there's been some studies that have been done about this, and grip strength for the hand, if you can feel your fingers touching your palm, according to some people in the knife world, that will limit grip strength and how tightly you can grab onto something. And so right now my mind is telling me not any tighter because I'm interacting with my own hand. If it was thicker and a little bit bigger, then I think I could get a little bit better grip strength in there, but I'm really not concerned about it because it has that flare. All right, it's got a guard on there, so I don't think my hands are going to slip forward on that, especially not my first finger position. I'd say it's pretty well built and thought through. And as far as the retention in the sheath, I'll talk about the sheath in a second. It doesn't appear to be wearing negatively against that rubber. That was another thing I was concerned about. Hardness of the rubber or polymer in general. If you get that wrong, it could wear against that, you know, relatively quickly. But so far, it looks like those detents are holding it in really well. As I previously mentioned, I think a blade of this length, like the cutting surface, is really practical. It's about hand width for me. So controllability is good. Practicality is very high. There's not a lot that a blade of this length is too much for or too short for. It just seems to hit most people's boxes pretty well. The thickness, there's so many opinions about blade thickness nowadays. It's hard to please everybody, including myself. But I'm going to say the grind, you know, it starts from right about here. It's kind of worn out, but if you can see that, the blade grind starts about here and it comes down. I'm going to say that robustness is very high. I was prying with it, I was prying some bark off, and I just had zero concern at all. The steel is very tough in the first place, but then the thickness, it adds to some confidence that it's not going to break or snap on you. And limited prying, yeah, it did just fine with that. Stabbing, you know, it's a little bit thick there, but it also gives you a little bit of power. I think stabbing wise, this is probably the ideal build for me if I need to poke into something. If it doesn't have a distal taper, which might be really cool and slicey and look good, but a distal taper would lose a little bit of that strength, which this maintains all the way down just about to here. And then it's going to neck down a little bit so you can actually get some piercing capability. I like knives with belly, and this has plenty of belly here. I think this flat portion meeting the belly line here is probably the most usable design for a blade in a utility fashion for me. I don't use a lot of other grinds or blade styles when I'm doing utility. I think this right here is the most practical, so for me it does well. And then again, that defensive use, you get some belly, you get some swoop in there, and that's something, I suppose this portion right here is really important for that. The blade was made in Taiwan, and it does seem to be pretty consistent with quality. I've looked at some of my friends who have done reviews on these already, and they had a good experience, good quality control. I think Demko has secured a good contract in who's making this for them, and that it's consistent, and I don't think we're going to see a bunch of factory seconds and wonky steel and bad handles or bad retention in the sheath. It looks like it's pretty consistent, and the 80 CRV, that seems to be reliable and appropriate. When I went to hone this again after using it for a few weeks, I actually had this out a little longer than I was supposed to before getting the review. I apologize about that to Demko. But I got a really good set of activities done with it and a lot of use. And the blade edge was mostly consistent all the way through that. I didn't have any chips or rolls with the kind of use that you were seeing here on the channel. And it took just a slight ceramic rod, actually not a stone, but a rod, just a touch up. And then I honed it on leather, and it's right back to shaving sharp. And I'm really, really satisfied with that right there. That's my favorite way to touch up a blade, is just to hit it with a ceramic rod very lightly, and then a piece of leather after that. Just a nice light strop, slightly toothy edge, not a totally perfect edge, just slightly toothy. That would be my preferred way to go. I think it's cool that the sheath is ambidextrous, so lefties can rejoice. This blade won't give you any trouble. All right, and it's kind of a unique design, if you can tell there. So you've got some retaining hardware holding in this sheath right here that goes through the back. And it would be very easy to modify or do different things with this, put it on a tech lock. I've seen Andrew Demko's personal models. I think he's used some ulti clips on certain ones where he wanted to do in the pocket carry, which is a really good idea, actually. But I've been using this on packs a lot. And so when I use this on a pack, actually the way that I prefer to hook it up is either to put some laces through this on the pack, and when I'm lazy, I literally just grab this right here because I trust it. I've used stuff like this for years. It's Velcro and it's got a button underneath, and so it is a little bit floppy if this button isn't done. That doesn't bother me a lot. It's going to stay in there. I'm not holding it upside down. It's not being carried upside down, so I'm not concerned about that. But it's a little bit floppy compared to like the rigidity of a tech lock. The advantage of that for somebody like me is in the winter time, I'm going to have this drop down a little bit from my belt line because I have a big heavy parka, a low coat, and I'm going to want to be able to access this by dropping it down on the belt line rather than carrying it up here on a tech lock or in a pocket, which will not be accessible when I have a big heavy parka on that goes basically below my belt line a good bit. The buttons seem pretty strong, not terribly difficult to actuate or take off, and getting the blade out is not bad at all. It's pretty quiet. It doesn't have a lot of rattle, a little bit, a little tiny bit. You're going to have trouble hearing it because it's so minimal, just a little bit of rattle in there. But if I can show you, I can kind of manufacture it a little bit. It rattles just that much right there. And inside, maybe I'll come in a little bit. So inside the sheath, let's take the knife out. You can see these little ridges. Those ridges, so there's 4 of them, those are going to grab onto the guard and the handle here. And like I was saying, it doesn't appear to be wearing negatively against those. And it does keep it in really well. So I'm not going to hang this upside down. That's not my style. I don't do stuff like that. But if you needed to, you know, you at least have this to add one more measure of security. But I recommend just keeping it the right way, tip down.